Good afternoon and welcome to our launch of our new VOX-Pol report. I'm Professor Stuart Macdonald. I'm a Professor of Law in Swansea University and I'm the coordinator of the VOX-Pol network. VOX-Pol, for those that haven't heard of it before, is an international network of researchers that look at online terrorism and extremism. And we have a variety of different activities within VOX-Pol, ranging from a blog, a lecture series, workshops, webinars, and of course, VOX-Pol reports, which are peer-reviewed publications that are freely available via the VOX-Pol website. And we're very pleased today to mark the publication of our newest report, which is authored by Marguerite Borelli and is titled Negotiating Responses to Online Terrorism Threats in the EU, State Platform Diplomacy 2015 to 2019. And I'm delighted to say that we have two colleagues that have agreed to come and discuss the report today with Marguerite, Gavin Sullivan and Valère Ndior. So I'll introduce our discussants first, and then I will invite Marguerite to say a little about her excellent report. So first of all, Marguerite Borelli is a postdoctoral researcher at the CNRS Centre for Internet and Society in Paris, where she currently works on the Claims of Open Research Area project, focusing on digital sovereignty. Her PhD thesis, completed in 2025, focused on the governance of terrorist content on social media, with an emphasis on the involvement of Meta, Google, and Twitter in countering terrorism and violent extremism, and the public-private relations this generates at various levels of governance. Valère Ndior is a professor of law at the Université de Bretagne, occidentale in France, the Lab Lex Research Centre. He's a junior fellow of the Institut Universitaire de France and a researcher at the Geode Centre, Geopolitics of the Datasphere. His research focuses on international law and tech regulation law. Valère's current research addresses social media governance, content moderation, online freedom of expression, international regulation of artificial intelligence, and international cybersecurity law. Gavin Sullivan is a reader in international human rights law at the University of Edinburgh Law School, where he leads the interdisciplinary UK-RI research project, Infralegalities, Global Security Infrastructures, AI and International Law. His current research examines how AI and automated decision-making are transforming global security law and governance, including the countering of terrorist and violent extremist content online. He is Vice Chair of the GIFCT's Independent Advisory Committee and co-editor of the academic journal Critical Studies in Security. Thank you to all three of you for joining today, and I'm going to immediately hand the floor over to Marguerite to present an overview of her report.
Thank you so much, Stuart, for the introductions. Thank you to VOX-Pol and its team for publishing this research and organizing this event. Huge thank you as well to Valère and Gavin for agreeing to share their thoughts on my work as discussants. So this report is actually based on a presentation that I did at the last TASM conference in Swansea. So it's sort of come full circle now, and I'm really glad that it's going to be more widely accessible. And in this presentation, I'm going to start by contextualizing this research a little bit more, and then go into its three main results. So to give you a bit of background, this report comes out of my PhD research, which was about the role of large social media corporations, Meta, Google, and Twitter, in the governance of online threats related to terrorism and violent extremisms. So in my PhD, I tried to keep up with the ways that individuals and organizations labeled as terrorists or violent extremists were using social media to look at what platform companies were doing about it, and then the public-private relations that this generated, going back to the idea that terrorism being a security issue, countering terrorism should be a state prerogative normally. And so I was really interested in looking at how these firms fit within a broader ecosystem of counterterrorism online, and how their activities in this realm were perceived by traditional actors of security. So when I became interested in this topic, it was 2015, 2016, so during the wave of ISIS attacks on many countries. And my disciplinary background, I should mention, is international relations. And in the international relations literature at the time, people who were thinking critically about the power of big tech in relation to security issues were people who mostly came from critical security studies and surveillance studies. And what came out of their work was a strong hypothesis of a collusion between state security apparatuses and big tech companies around a common interest in harvesting as much data as possible for surveillance purposes. But then what you had in the public sphere in parallel was the strict opposite of a collusion. So for a while, every time there was an ISIS attack that occurred, you had politicians who were almost blaming the attack on social media. And this fed into a narrative that opposed powerful US firms with an absolutist conception of free speech and huge amounts of power to European states that were to impose their cultural and legal understandings of free speech in their own online public spheres. So it's really this puzzle that got me interested, and looking at all that's been done since then. So GIFCT, the Christchurch call, negotiations at the UN level, at the OECD. This is actually another area of my PhD that I hope to publish soon, which was mapping what is really quite an extensive international public-private ecosystem dedicated to countering terrorism online, which really stands out compared to other areas of content regulation like disinformation or hate speech. So within this broader context in mind, this report focuses on some of the earliest negotiations laying the groundwork for this ecosystem within the EU in the timeframe of 2015 till 2019, which is when the EU Internet Forum was launched, when Europol's Internet referral unit was launched, and also when the terrorist content online regulation, the TCO or TERREG, was negotiated. And the idea of the report is to focus on lived experiences of those negotiations by some of their protagonists to uncover how they laid the groundwork for what was to come and how stakeholders navigated power relations to establish a form of cooperation despite those power relations. So because of the focus on lived experiences, the report mobilizes and really revolves around the interviews that I've conducted with stakeholders. And for the rest of this presentation, I will briefly highlight 3 results that came out of these interviews and which constitute the structure of the report. The first of those results is that the relationship between platform companies and public authorities in the EU, perhaps unsurprisingly, was affected by cultural fault lines, which are well known in the wider content governance literature, and which pertain to the fact that Meta, Google, and Twitter are US-based firms, Silicon Valley-based companies, which translates into pretty specific views around the place of the state in a market economy and around new technologies as means of empowering individuals to free themselves from traditional power structures, one of those power structures being the state. So this means that the companies see themselves and market themselves as counterpowers to states, and actually sometimes fear being seen to collaborate with states, and even more so in a post-Snowden world. So as you can imagine, this was a source of considerable frustration for European public authorities, for whom the role of companies was really to respect local legislation. And yeah, this is something that's really well exemplified with the quote on the slide from a representative of the German Ministry of Interior, who told me many large tech companies that feed off of selling and exploiting user data have more or less successfully portrayed themselves in society as guardians of the rights of their users in opposition to bad states. The social contract is the other way around, though. It is the state who is charged with upholding the rights of its citizens. So that's the first result, that these cultural fault lines on a macro level really frame the relationship between the EU authorities and social media companies, and actually weighed on early discussions about terrorist content. The second thing that came out of my interviews, though, is that despite those cultural differences on the specific issue of terrorist content online, there was really a consensus that emerged quite quickly around the notion that algorithmic moderation of terrorist content was desirable in the name of scale and efficiency. And what's interesting here is that it was actually the authorities who were the ones to push for these measures, often by telling the private sector, you did it for CSAM, for child pornography content, why aren't you doing it for terrorism? Which, by the way, is a way of completely depoliticizing what terrorism is. So in other words, the sort of technological solutionism that you'd normally expect from big tech companies actually came from public authorities, in this case, with the industry taking up this demand soon after. And this shared enthusiasm for technical solutions to TVEC was sufficient to warrant the development of what I called in the report state platform diplomacy. And by diplomacy here, I mean the management of alterity, so the deployment of strategies that seek to avoid disagreements turning into conflict, or further upstream to reduce the possibility of such disagreements. There are 4 elements to this that were salient in my interviews. The first one was that public authorities really began these discussions around terrorist content by framing the issue as a matter of sovereignty. So our laws should be applied online as they are offline, right? This was the leitmotif for the German Netzdg in particular. And this was actually a big facilitating factor in negotiations on terrorism, because what it did was completely evacuate the issue of the role of social media in processes of radicalization into violence. So yeah, it allowed the authorities to avoid questions of echo chambers or filter bubbles that were really a red line for the platforms at the time. The second strategy that public authorities deployed was that they really took advantage of a broader context of techlash, so of all the scandals that were tarnishing the reputation of social media companies at the time, Cambridge Analytica, foreign interference, to bring those companies to the table, because those companies really needed to start positioning themselves as trustworthy actors again and responsible actors. The third strategy that public authorities and platforms deployed was their choice of negotiators, so casting choices. Both sectors worked on sending people to the negotiations who, to some extent, knew the other party and knew how to speak to them. So on the side of companies, there was really a hiring spree of people with past public services experience or past academic experience, who were going into either public policy departments or trust and safety functions. And we could also observe similar dynamics, though to a lesser extent, in the public sector. And lastly, the other key element in the development of state platform diplomacy was institutional innovation. And by this, I mean that at the EU level and at the national level in some countries, authorities recognized that their relationships to big tech were both sufficiently novel and sufficiently important that they actually warranted the creation of new institutions to host them. And so those institutions, chiefly the various internet referral units, as well as the EU Internet Forum, according to respondents, were really key elements that helped stakeholders actually develop working relationships. So those are the main points or results that I wanted to tell you about. I'm going to stop here to leave the floor to Valère and Gavin. I hope you enjoy the report, and feel free to shoot me an email if you have some feedback. I will stop sharing my screen.
Well, thank you very much, Marguerite, for summarizing the report so effectively. For those that would like to read the report in full, we've put a link to it in the chat so that you can download it and have a read of the full report at your convenience. But we're now going to hear from our two discussants. So I will hand over first of all to Valère. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So first, thanks to VOX-Pol for the invite. I'm really excited to be here to get the opportunity to read the report just a few days before it's launched. Well, actually, it's not launched. And to get another opportunity to discuss with Marguerite Borelli. She did a great job. This report is really fascinating and thought-provoking. And so I'm just launching my timer. I'm going to take this opportunity to make a few comments and remarks about some aspects from the report that I really enjoyed or that are going to spark some discussion, some debate, I think, and also provide perhaps some update regarding some policy from France that you mentioned, because I feel like a lot has happened in the past few months that actually confirm most of your analysis. So I guess I will share three sets of remarks regarding this great report. First, regarding the report itself and some key analysis that I enjoyed. I think the report really provides a thorough analysis based on a valuable collection of statements and interviews from both industry and public stakeholders. And I feel that all these quotes that was really useful to me shed light on the balance between request for regulation, self-regulation. We get to understand the inner workings of the mechanism and aimed at tackling TVEC. And what was the most interesting to me was the perceived effectiveness of the partnerships that have been established between states and platforms. So not just analyzing them from an objective point of view, but also get to know what stakeholders actually think about this and how it works. So from what I understood, I think this report really greatly highlights the divide between, the US approach and the European approach, based mostly on the French case. You've coined that as cultural fault lines, trying to analyze the different views from the state's role. And from what I understood, and I totally agree with that, in the US, the state action should be seen as minimal when it comes to tackling TVEC online. So basically, much of what Europe considers as illegal content is protected under the First Amendment. It benefits also from a protection from the Section 230 regulation. And in contrast, when it comes to France and to EU in general, public authorities believe that it's a state, not private platforms, that should safeguard citizens' rights. We are going to bring some nuance to this a bit later, but I think this sums up what you've been explaining. And based on that, the report shows us that this ideological difference is going to translate into governance, but also, operational tactics. When it comes to governance, US approach relies on the voluntary self-regulation, but by platforms. They view EU initiatives as something that might be akin to censorship. We had some debates for the past month between like the EU Commission and the US Congress accusing EU of actually regulating in order to censor US companies. But it is true that at the same time, France has spent like most of the past 5 years pushing for stricter rules at EU level, insisting that national law should be applied online. And so it has actually led to this binding direct regulation on online content. When it comes to the operational tactics, this ideological difference is also shown in your report. That was really fascinating to me. I never like actually envisioned this, but the way you showed that US platforms emphasize, like counter narratives to weaken extremist message, arguing that government-sponsored discourse lacks credibility. That was really interesting to us because I think as a French lawyer, I was not really able to understand that from my research. And thanks to your example, it was really important to show the divide between, like the French approach. Okay, we need to take down this content with the support from the authorities, while in the US, it's more about building counter narratives, relying on private communities, students, to actually tackle terrorism. So that was really interesting. You have been mentioning a lot, maybe we'll debate that a bit later, the golden hour and all the controversy that it sparked in France and the US. But as you mentioned, there are some common points between the two approaches. That is like the enthusiasm for like automated moderation, as the go-to method to actually address terrorism. So that would be like my first set of remarks about what I enjoyed about the report, and that cultural divide that you explained to us, but resorting to like really relevant quotes, interviews, and point of view, and so that brings like a new light to elements that we actually already knew, but you're actually bringing a testimonies that makes it totally different and more accurate. More briefly, second set of remarks, and it's going to be a bit more brief. It's about the TVEC governance ecosystem. And I think this is also a reason why I was invited, because I had the opportunity to be involved in some research and work in the GIF City a few years ago, then at the CCAN. And really, I felt like when I finished reading your report, I became totally pessimistic about this. I wondered, and perhaps this is a question that we'll discuss a bit later. I feel like the TVEC governance ecosystem is really at a crossroads. I hope it's not at a dead end. When it comes to the CCAN, I think we need to ask where it stands today. I feel like this is some feedback that I've got in France, that the CCAN benefits from limited support and involvement from France, from the French authorities. So that means that I feel like France, I don't know about other countries, but is not supporting this endeavor anymore. And so it might be the end of the CCAN as we know it. I hope I'm wrong. And I think based on this, like your report, brings us to actually discussing and considering who can legitimately, effectively handle the mechanism aimed at tackling like TVEC content online. Should this responsibility lie with private actors? Is it public authorities? Should we try to push more and support hybrid entities such as the GIF City, CCAN, and so on? This is an open question, but I feel that governance issue about the ecosystem, the TVEC ecosystem, is unsettled. It's still an open question. I don't know if we can still like rely on GIF City and CCAN in like 2, 3, or 4 years, considering the lack of support from some really important state involved in the process. Finally, really briefly, because I see that I have 2 minutes left, regarding your approach and your comments about France and the general debate about how we should tackle like a TVEC online. So on page 21 from your report, thanks to a quote from a respondent from Google, I think it is, the report raised the issue of the role of administrative authorities in France versus the judge when it comes to addressing and tackling TVEC content. And I found this really thought-provoking because it actually connects directly to current debate and controversies regarding the regulation of social media to counter disinformation, to address sensitive content, unlawful content. And this is a discussion that has been going on for the past 5 years. It's like literally a never-ending controversy. In 2020, we were all involved in that discussion regarding the FVO law and its potential to infringe on human rights and freedom of expression. And today we are having the same debate. I mean, it's literally exactly a decade now after the Paris attacks from November 2015. And you may have noticed that a few days ago, on November 13, President Macron, in his speech, explicitly mentioned the Terrorism regulation as a tool to actually address disinformation. But at the same time, he's pushing for a new agenda in order to address issues regarding sensitive content, disinformation, and so on. And so I feel like social media accountability is a convenient tool, convenient political tool that is being pushed again in the debate today due to the calendar, to the fact that it's just like a decade after the Paris attacks. But I don't feel like French authorities have developed like a clear stand, a clear position about their willingness to push for like active support of hybrid entities, active support of DSA. Actually, it's even more the other way around. I just finished on that. I just want to mention to people online that would not be familiar with this, but there's a tendency this past month from French authorities, from French governments, to actually bypass administrative mechanisms or DSA mechanism aimed at tackling illegal online content or sensitive online content. So when it comes to like pornographic content, CSAM, when it comes to extreme content or speech, French authorities have been bypassing, they have been like undercutting mechanism that it has been pushing for a few years when it comes to this DSA and Terreg. And so I think there's some kind of confusion or ambiguity from the French authorities. Like this diplomacy is not that clear because French authorities have been really bypassing mechanisms that have been advocating for a few years. And I would love, this is my last sentence, sorry, I would love to know your take on this, Marguerite, because I feel like we are at a crossroads when it comes to actually seeing how the DSA and other relevant instruments are going to be used or not to actually contain extreme speech. So sorry for being too long. I'm going to keep it here and hopefully we can discuss that together.
Well, thank you very much, Valère, for 3 sets of really interesting and thought-provoking points. And Marguerite will have the opportunity to respond in a moment. But first, I'd like to invite Gavin to share his insights. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stuart. Thanks to the VOX-Pol network as well for having me. Thanks, Valère, for those comments. And Marguerite, thank you for a fantastic report. I mean, one of the most exciting things about this report is its level of empirical detail and its rigor. So with the insights that are drawn here from platform experts and government officials throughout this very active period of regulatory change from 2015 to 2019 are really fascinating. And I think that's one of the things that really sets this report apart from a lot of the other kind of more descriptive and functional accounts of that period of regulation. So it's a riveting read. And for those who haven't had the chance to read it yet, I would really emphasize that you do. It's a great report. Thanks so much for putting it out there. Just a few opening comments to start. Hopefully we can pick this up in the discussion later. So on the one hand, the report argues that cultural fault lines played a critically important role here in shaping what EU governance of TVEC became. So cultural divisions between the kind of Silicon Valley firms that are infused with a kind of libertarian distrust of the state, EU member states concerned with public internet regulation and getting ISIS material offline as quickly as possible, the US government who've long privileged big tech self-regulation and been wary about censoring protected speech online. Yet, on the other hand, the report also notes that despite these differences, platforms and states were already deeply enmeshed and informally cooperating on TVEC governance and removal in a number of key ways. The FBI, for example, were informally referring content to Twitter to take down, just as UK policing and intelligence services have long worked hand in glove with Meta and the other platforms to remove content like that. And as we saw with the Snowden leaks, which were referred to in the report, all of the platforms had been granting the US government backdoor access to their user data for counterterrorism purposes as well, despite the platforms claiming to protect user privacy and resist Big Brother state surveillance and so on. So my first question really is or comment really is, how important do you think these cultural divisions actually were in the practice of settling EU arrangements for governing TVEC? In one way, the report sets this out as an example of regulatory convergence, where different actors with different expectations gradually coalesce and develop consensus on a common frame and a common language for responding to this. But if platforms and states were already entangled and informally collaborating behind the scenes to do much of this work, might these cultural divisions been strategically overstated, I guess? And if so, why? And what effect was this difference having between saying that we're very different in our expectations, but actually cooperating at a technical level very closely? Secondly, I was reminded of something that US law and technology scholar Julie Cohen wrote about in her book, Configuring the Network Self, where she talked about public-private architectures of control, where, quote, each participant in the development of digital architectures of control sees in the other's goals a window of opportunity. And I think that in many ways resonates with the findings of your report. So here, platforms got to defer and shape EU regulation and advance industry-led self-regulation of TVEC as key. And states got platforms really to take a much more hands-on, proactive approach to TVEC governance and use automated tools more widely in doing that work as well. In my research on this issue, I also observed two other effects which were kind of latent in the report, and I wanted to kind of just highlight those to see what you thought, Marguerite, in terms of what the different parties got. And really, this was an invitation to kind of ask you, what else did they get from this arrangement, if we think of it as a regulatory settlement? On the one hand, I think states got platforms to create new norms about defining and governing terrorism and violent extremism on the internet. Now, this is an incredibly difficult and complex area to regulate. It's been politically fraught for governments to push these measures through parliaments and so on. So in a way, through this settlement, they got the world's biggest companies to build a normative practice and set of norms around what this stuff was. And I think that's hugely productive. And in terms of what platforms got, and I think you alluded to this in your presentation just a moment ago, Marguerite, they were really able to deflect regulatory attention away from their own role, perhaps, in algorithmic amplification of violent content, which I think was first raised as a critical issue in the Christchurch call, and is key to how platforms work and make profit, but incredibly difficult to regulate. So as far as platforms were concerned, that's a huge win. Thirdly, the report talks about algorithmic tools for TVEC as a form of techno-solutionism, but that allowed the states and the platforms to find common ground. But I'd really be interested to hear more about how devices, for example, like the GIFCT's hash sharing database, and the increasing use of AI tools by the platforms, how did that shape the regulatory politics in that context as well? For example, did that techno-solutionism strengthen platforms and weaken states in these kind of regulatory struggles around how TVEC is to be governed? And finally, so the report kind of ends at 2019, and of course, there's so much that's happened since then in this space, including, as Valère was just saying, the coming into force of the Digital Services Act, the strategic realignments prompted by the Trump administration's America First free speech online agenda, platforms beginning to dismantle, I think, some of their TVEC content moderation infrastructure, and the kind of more recent attacks on EU regulatory oversight as well by platforms. So I think the final question is, what lessons do you think we can draw from the report and that very fertile period of regulatory governance to help us understand the politics of TVEC regulation in the present, in the now? And where do you think research ought to be taking place in the current context? Where's the most important lines of research to develop? So thanks so much. Those are my opening comments, and hopefully we can pick some of that up in the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gavin. And I'd just like to quickly remind the audience that there is a Q&A function, so you are welcome to post your questions and anything that you would like to ask Marguerite or the discussants. So please do make use of that Q&A function. But I'll now give Marguerite an opportunity to respond to Valère and Gavin.
Thank you so much to both of you for your comments. All of them were super interesting. I don't have answers to everything, but I'll try to go through some of the points which have sparked some specific thoughts for me. The first point from Valère about the cultural divide in the EU versus US approach to TVEC, with the EU focusing on content takedowns, which can be seen as censorship, versus the US focusing on counter narratives. This is something which I feel was very big around 2015 up until I'm not sure when it ceased to be relevant really, but I feel like this whole discussion around TVEC really started with the issue of counter narratives. A lot of actors who are now active in this space started with counter narratives programs. A lot of them implemented the counter-narrative programs in relation to platforms or with the platforms actively. And so I'm thinking of organizations like Tech Against Terrorism or ISD, for instance, or Moonshot CVE. And more or less all of them, as their research progressed, sort of decided that counter-narratives were no longer a priority, because the issue from a radicalization standpoint was really platforms' business models. And so I think that's a really important point to highlight. Meanwhile, the US still, the US official position is still that counter narratives are the best response to terrorist content online, and that platform firms have been self-regulating in a very efficient manner, which I think is really ironic considering how much this self-regulation was actually generated by pressures from the EU in particular. About what Macron said on the Terreg being a tool for disinformation, I'm not sure I see what he means. I do see from his administration a persistent temptation to expand what has been done on terrorism to disinformation. And I remember in particular that Jean-Noël Barrot, before he was named foreign minister, he was the secretary for digital affairs, and he mentioned that on several occasions that GIFCT should serve as a model to counter disinformation as well. That's something that, from what I can tell, not many actors have picked up on, probably because the definition of disinformation is even more controversial than the definition of terrorism. But still, it's really interesting that they are still pushing for this this approach, and I'm very curious to see if it leads to anything concrete or not. what else can I say? To Gavin's point, maybe about how the technology space or technological tools shaped the regulatory negotiation around TVEC. Something that I thought was very interesting, and that's also linked to a specific French context, I think, of the Macron administration, but I would be curious to know if you observe the same thing in the UK, is that there is still, but it's a little bit less now, sort of fascination on the side of state actors with Silicon Valley companies, the way they organize themselves and their technologies. So I think in all of the regulatory negotiations surrounding TVEC, one thing that is striking is really a conflict of interest where the largest companies have systematically been involved in negotiations as potential objects of regulation, but also as sort of consultants on what is possible or not, what can be done or not from a technical standpoint. And yeah, I think that's something that has weighed heavily on the end result of the TerrReg in particular, also because it's most often the largest companies who are consulted, but then the regulation doesn't just apply to the largest companies, it also applies to the smallest ones, which raises a whole range of other issues. Yeah, I might stop here to see if there are questions from the audience, but thank you so much for the feedback. It was super valuable.
Thank you very much for those responses. I'd like to ask a question which picks up, I think, on particularly some of Valère's observations around the role of civil society organisations. So obviously the report has focused on the tech industry and on public bodies. Would you or one of the discussants like to say a bit more about where civil society organisations fit in this picture, and in particular, do they get kind of a meaningful opportunity to affect the direction of travel, or is there some validity to claims that actually they're not really given an effective voice and their role really just serves to legitimate the policies and the measures that are taken?
Should I take this one, Marguerite? It's funny because we actually had that discussion with Marguerite. It's obviously like an ongoing discussion. So perhaps I'll give my point of view because let's say that I think it was mentioned a few minutes ago, like the hash sharing processes and also partnership, like the knowledge sharing and so on. I think the civil society, maybe not civil society, but hybrid bodies were really active and they had that meaningful opportunity to chime in a few years ago. And here I'm referring from the early, let's say, early 2020s. Because at that point, I feel like they really benefited from meaningful involvement from states, or at least like, let's say, public authorities, but also from major tech companies such as Meta, Twitter, and so on. And I feel like they were at maybe the center, or maybe there was some kind of cornerstone of that state platform diplomacy that you analyze, Marguerite, because these bodies, they serve as spaces for like experts from like Ministry of Interior, Foreign Affairs, and so on, to actually engage directly with experts from tech companies. But my feeling is, and when I say my feeling, it's actually a statement because I got the opportunity to see from the inside how it evolved, is at some point you didn't get any feedback when it comes to France from authorities that were tasked with like overseeing the activity of the, let's say, like the CCAN, the report. And so I feel their role is as meaningful as long as they benefit from actual like involvement from both the tech companies. But thanks to the Elon Musk takeover, thanks to the evolution of Meta's governance, and a lack perhaps of interest from the French state, when you discuss the CCAN, it's mostly like France and New Zealand, right? I feel like they are losing some momentum. They are still active, they are still publishing some reports, but I feel they are not so much at the center of the diplomacy game that you mentioned and that you analyzed, Marguerite. So this is what my analysis about this. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't see them as active as they used to be. And they don't have that much visibility compared with, like, let's say, the 2021, 2022. I don't know if Gavin has some feeling about this, but yeah.
Yeah, just quickly, thanks, Valère. I mean, I think my knowledge of civil society activism on this issue within the EU is fairly limited, but from my own experience and research in the GIF-CT space, for example, I think there certainly was quite a lot of civil society engagement in GIF-CT in the early days, including a lot of critical engagement. That's certainly tapered off, I think. Over the years, a number of organizations have become actively disinterested in engaging on this issue, and I think that's a question as to why. There were some human rights audits, for example, done, the BSR human rights audit of GIF-CT, and interestingly, an organization like GIF-CT has long talked about itself as a multi-stakeholder, adopting a multi-stakeholder approach, but not actually a multi-stakeholder initiative. A multi-stakeholder initiative would actually look towards sharing power and knowledge among all of the different actors involved, and GIF-CT hasn't done that. A multi-stakeholder approach is loosely inspired by a multi-stakeholder initiative, but decision-making is still taken largely by the firms themselves. So I think if we were to think about governance in this space as driven by business and human rights principles, where engagement with civil society and those who are working with people affected is one key way that platforms can deepen their engagement with civil society, then that may open up possibilities to deepen that form of participation. But that's not a route that the platforms have taken in this space. States have been pretty wary of bringing civil society in as well, largely because this is the area of counterterrorism is security sensitive. It's not something that can be openly discussed with civil society organizations. I think there's ample opportunities for civil society and human rights organizations, those who are working with affected people, to play a more prominent role, but that really needs states and platforms to open the door for that. And to date, there's been very little. Perhaps DSA provisions on researcher access and transparency may open new routes for deeper participation, but we'll have to wait and see on that front.
Yeah, I completely agree with both of you. And I can also add that one thing which I observed during my PhD, which I thought impacted the TVEC space quite a lot, was that so civil society is a really broad term. And so when states or platforms talk about consulting civil society, I think it's really important to ask, okay, but which civil society? Because when you look at who are the actors involved in CCAN, in the GIF-CT, in who are the actors invited to the EU Internet Forum or to the UN, often it's the same people. So yeah, that raises a first set of questions. And then a second set of questions revolves around the fact that civil society on the issue of TVEC is really divided. You have on the one side people like EDRI or EFF, or in France, La Quadrature du Net, so like digital liberties advocates who like generally oppose content moderation. And then on the other side, you have child protection or anti-racism organizations who strongly support moderation and more or less it's like blanket positions, really black and white, and it's like those two sections of civil society don't communicate with each other, which allows states and platforms to cherry pick who they talk to depending on the position that they want to defend. So if they want to defend a position that's pro-moderation, for more active moderation at the expense of freedom of speech, then they're gonna, consult with anti-racism and child protection NGOs. If they want to push back against states wanting to weaken encryption, for instance, then they'll go to digital liberties organizations. So I think there's really or something that would be quite useful is if civil society organization engaged with one another on these issues to sort of form coalitions that are more, I don't know, intentional. Yeah.
I think that leads quite neatly into the next question I was going to ask, which is about dissenting voices. And I guess you could also describe it potentially as an echo chamber, which is the term that's used a lot in this space, but in a different way. Valère talked about the interviewees' perceived effectiveness of the partnerships, and Gavin talked about the arrangements being mutually beneficial. So if you have the actors that are mutually benefiting and they perceive everything as being quite effective, where do the dissenting voices come from? Is there scope for dissenting voices to participate in these discussions?
Yeah, I mean, just if I can quickly jump in, Stuart, I think building on my response to the last comment, I think that there's little space for dissenting voice, and that's a problem and a cause of concern in this space. One of the things which was mentioned in the report, and I think it's critically important, is this whole of society approach to countering TVEC online. This was a discourse that both states, security agencies, and platforms kind of agreed on, and as a way of kind of doing work in this space together. I totally agree with Marguerite. I think it's very much an epistemic community in terms of the civil society actors are largely the same. They're very instrumentalized in this space. They're often cherry-picked by the key actors to push particular points of view. There really does need to be, I think, stronger engagement with dissenting voices, and that means making difficult conversations possible. For example, platforms should be talking far more openly with people who are adversely affected by their content moderation decisions and bringing them into the policy design conversation. They can't do that if they're making signing non-disclosure agreements a condition of having conversations with people, or if they're worried about the controversies that those kinds of conversations would cause. So there needs to be an openness of conversation on those fronts. I think states could play a key role brokering some of those conversations, but that also requires some confidence in states to open up that space. And to date, that hasn't really happened. So yes, there is a need for dissenting voices, particularly given the geopolitical situation we find ourselves in today, where powerful states and powerful platforms are working far more closely together. That underscores the need for dissenting voices now more than ever, I think.
Yeah.
I definitely agree.
If I can really quickly jump in, and I think it was mentioned in Margaret's report, I feel like there are two levels of dissenting voices. The first being like in that ecosystem of state diplomacy with state platform diplomacy. Obviously, the global south is a major issue. When you get the opportunity to discuss with researchers from the south, they tell you that they do not get the opportunity to actually be involved and engage, well, even for financial reasons sometimes, but to actually engage with platforms when they consult on, when they are taking some comments or feedback from the users, from civil society. So as you mentioned, Marguerite, it's mostly the same organization and the same civil society from the north, let's say. So this is like a major issue. It's not limited to social media and TVEC issue. It's tech regulation issue, like actually involving communities from the South. And as you mentioned, and this is something I was thinking about, and you said it, Marguerite, some civil society organizations are not invited either by the states when they are actually organizing some summits meeting regarding like online moderation, or by the platform when it comes to organizing like hybrid events. So I think there's like a gray area of, like the middle area of civil society voices that are not involved, invited, represented, because they don't actually get an opportunity to do so. And so their only option is actually to advocate online, drafting some reports, trying to do some outreach activities, but they will not be invited in public or private events pertaining to TVEC regulation. And I think this is a major issue that you saw in your report, and that should be addressed largely today.
Yeah, I agree.
And maybe as we're coming to the end of the hour, maybe I could finish, Marguerite, by asking you one final question. You explained that the report stems from a PhD chapter. Could you give us a sneak preview of the argument of the rest of the PhD? And alongside that, could you tell us a little bit about where you think future research priorities should lie?
Sure. So about research priorities, I definitely feel like studying the role of civil society in this space is really important, and sort of digging into what type of society civil society defends what type of position, and when they are given a voice to express it or not. I feel like maybe it could be interesting with the current situation with X and Meta changing their governance structures, but also with the fact that now platforms have also been thinking about how to operate in contexts where governments aren't trustworthy. So, for instance, the first major public case, I think, was Myanmar and the Rohingya genocide, where a UN report pointed to Facebook and WhatsApp as a major facilitator of the genocide. And Meta at that time developed, I don't know if it was a policy but they openly stated that for such cases in which the government wasn't a trusted party, they would start relying more on civil society to make their policy choices. I thought that was interesting. It raises again the question of who is civil society, but I would be very curious to see if the platforms have the guts to implement it now in their home country with their government pressuring them. Yeah, I think pressuring them, but also legally who isn't allowed to pressure them. So maybe that's a way for the companies to, yeah, I don't know, to stay on the right side of history in an ideal world. Yeah, those are, I guess, the two main directions I would encourage people to go in, or that I'm interested in personally. I also think another one is the professionalization of trust and safety as a career path. I think it's super interesting, and the effects of revolving door moves. So how people from the private sector move into public sector roles and vice versa, and the sort of baggage and methodologies and ideals that they carry with them, and whether this has an effect or not on the public and private sectors. I think that's also a really interesting area for further research. And yeah, about my PhD, I guess the main argument was that large platform companies have really played a key role in developing counterterrorism online. And this is something that I documented up to 2021 because I had to stop my research at some point. So I went until after the Christchurch call, but obviously 2021 feels like a long time ago now. So yeah, if anyone wants to continue this work and see what's happening since then, that would be awesome as well.
Well, thank you ever so much. And I can't believe an hour has passed already. It's gone ever so quickly. I've really enjoyed the conversation. So thank you again to Gavin and to Valère, and most of all to Marguerite for taking the time to discuss the report. I recommend everybody watching goes and downloads the report and has a read of it. It's a really readable, thought-provoking piece. You can find it on the VOX-Pol website. And while you're on the VOX-Pol website, have a look at our other resources. There's many other reports and a whole host of other things on there. So please do check that out as well. But thank you again to our panelists, and I hope everyone has a good rest of the day. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.